You're nothing more than a servant." The words hit Ava like a thunderbolt, sharp and cutting. The room, once buzzing with chatter and clinking glasses, froze in place. Even the soft hum of the kitchen, the ambient music playing in the background, seemed to vanish in that instant. Everyone turned to watch, and in the middle of the room, Ava stood still, holding a tray with perfect composure, her expression calm as ever, though her heart raced. Charles Thompson, billionaire CEO of Thompson Industries, a man used to being adored and respected, sneered at her. His voice, dripping with condescension, filled the air once more. "Do you even know what you're doing here?" he continued, barely pausing. "I bet you don't even understand the value of what you're holding." The words, meant to belittle, hung in the air, thick with disdain. Ava had heard worse before, she had lived through worse. But the audacity of this moment in front of all these influential people was something different. The silence in the room became deafening, every eye now fixed on her, waiting for her to react, to cower, to apologize. But Ava didn't flinch. Instead, she simply nodded politely, her eyes meeting his for a brief second. She had worked here for 3 years, seen enough, learned enough. She knew her place, or at least that's what the world told her. A woman like her, black, in her 20s, working as a waitress in one of the most prestigious restaurants in the city, wasn't supposed to be seen or heard. But tonight, she felt something shift deep inside her. She had had enough of being invisible. The insult was sharp, but Ava had learned to make her silence her weapon. As she approached the table, a cold chill passed over her. She reached for the wine bottle, her hand steady as ever. Charles, his smile still arrogant, watched her closely, waiting for a sign of weakness. But Ava wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. She moved gracefully, her actions fluid and controlled, as though the tension in the room didn't exist at all. She poured the wine with the same precision she'd honed over the years, her movements sharp but elegant. She could feel the weight of the gazes on her, but she didn't let it break her. Ava had learned long ago that the best way to survive was not to respond with anger or fear. It was to stay calm, to keep your dignity intact, and to bide your time. As she finished pouring, she glanced at Charles one more time. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She simply covered his mouth with her hand. For a moment everything stopped. The room held its breath, and the world seemed to fall away. Charles, the man who thought he ruled everything around him, stood frozen. His lips parted in disbelief. The silence between them spoke louder than any words ever could. Ava didn't move. She kept her hand there, pressing just enough to make her point clear. The room remained in stunned silence. No one dared to break it. Charles, the mighty billionaire, stood at a loss for words, completely taken aback by the quiet power of this young woman who had been written off as nothing more than a servant. In that moment Ava knew. She wasn't invisible anymore. She had taken control. The world would see her now. The room remained eerily quiet, every single person at the table unable to tear their eyes away from Ava. Charles Thompson stood there, his mouth still covered by her hand, frozen in disbelief. He had expected to see fear, to witness submission, but instead he saw something that made him feel vulnerable. For a brief moment he felt what it was like to be powerless. Ava kept her hand firmly in place, her expression calm, her eyes unwavering as she looked directly into his. She knew this was her moment. The tables had turned, and now all eyes were on her, watching to see what she would do next. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence, in that moment, spoke volumes louder than anything she could have said. As time seemed to stretch on, the tension in the room thickened. Charles's hand twitched, and for the first time that evening, he looked uncertain. The confident billionaire, who had once wielded his power over people like Ava, now stood still, uncertain of how to handle this shift in dynamics. He took a deep breath, clearly trying to regain control, but the moment had already slipped from his grasp. He tried to speak, but Ava tightened her grip just slightly, a simple but firm reminder that he could not just resume his superiority. The crowd was hushed. Everyone was waiting for the next move. And then, Ava slowly removed her hand, stepping back just enough to let the tension break. Charles, now freed, swallowed hard, but his arrogance seemed to falter. The once celebrated CEO was no longer the imposing figure he had been just moments ago. He opened his mouth, his words meant to restore his authority, but they came out as a whisper, strained and uncertain. "What do you think you're doing?" he finally managed to ask, but the challenge in his voice was gone. Ava didn't look down, didn't flinch. She simply smiled softly and took a step back, her presence commanding the room in a way Charles had never imagined. For the first time he saw her, not as a servant but as someone who held her own, someone who had power. The onlookers who had once been caught up in the dominance of Charles's presence now shifted their focus. They saw Ava. They saw her strength, her dignity. The room, which had once echoed with whispers of Charles's triumphs, now buzzed with murmurs of admiration for the woman who had put him in his place. Charles, still stunned, glanced around, and for the first time that night, he felt the weight of everyone's eyes not on him but on her. He shifted in his seat, the weight of the moment pressing on him, and he realized, too late, that his attempt to belittle her had only made her rise. It was not just a game anymore. It was a reminder that power, when misused, can be taken away just as quickly as it's given. And Ava, the woman who was so easily dismissed, had just proved that point in the most unforgettable way. The silence in the room stretched on, thick with tension as Ava stood her ground. Charles Thompson, once the dominant figure in the room, now appeared to shrink in the wake of her defiance. The once smooth edges of his calculated confidence were now jagged and uncertain. Ava had proven something in that moment. She had shown that respect could not be bought, that it had to be earned. Charles wiped his hand over his face, as if trying to brush off the shock of the situation. He glanced at the others around the table, but no one spoke. No one was willing to challenge what had just happened. Ava, meanwhile, did not look away. Her gaze remained firm, steady, as if she had known all along that this moment would come. Her hand had been placed over his mouth not in anger, but in a quiet assertion of her worth. The room, which had once filled with whispers of admiration for Charles, now buzzed with hushed murmurs of admiration for Ava. It was clear that the dynamics had shifted, and with it the power in the room. Charles sat back in his chair, his posture now sagging, the swagger replaced by discomfort. Ava had not only silenced him physically, but had also stripped him of his air of superiority. He was no longer the man who commanded attention without saying a word. In that split second he was just another person, vulnerable and unsure of himself. The other guests, who had once been caught up in the charisma of the billionaire CEO, now shifted their attention to Ava. It was as if they were seeing her for the first time, not as a mere server but as a force in her own right. Charles's attempts to regain control were feeble. He straightened up, trying to return to his usual authoritative self, but his words fell flat. "This isn't how I do business," he muttered, trying to regain his usual arrogance. But no one was listening anymore. His words, once so commanding, now seemed hollow in comparison to the quiet strength that Ava had just demonstrated. The murmurs in the room grew louder, with a few guests casting glances at each other, their expressions shifting from shock to something else, something that resembled respect. Charles shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly unnerved by the turn of events. The once unchallenged CEO of one of the world's leading companies was now visibly shaken. Ava, on the other hand, remained composed. She had made her point, and now, with nothing but the weight of her silence, she had won. The balance of power had shifted, and Charles knew it. Ava's quiet dignity had commanded the room, leaving behind the echo of her strength long after the words had stopped. She wasn't just a woman working in a fancy restaurant. She was a woman who had been underestimated, who had been silenced for too long, and who had just proven her worth. Ava didn't need to say anything else. She turned away, continuing her work, as though nothing had happened, but everyone in the room knew something had changed. The dynamic had been forever altered. Charles Thompson had been brought down not by force, but by the strength of someone who had been overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated. And as the room slowly returned to its uneasy quiet, one thing was clear. Ava had taken back her power. She had shown them all what it meant to be truly seen. The atmosphere in the room remained tense, but it was different now. Ava had made her mark, and Charles Thompson was no longer the center of attention. As she moved across the room, carrying out her duties with the same poise and grace she always had, the guests seemed to watch her with new eyes. The whispers that had once been about Charles's power now shifted to the woman who had stood up to him, to the woman who had silenced him without a single word. Ava's heart was still pounding in her chest, But her composure remained unbroken. She had faced the challenge and come out victorious, but there was something deeper happening here. It wasn't just about the moment of silence she had created. It was about something far more profound, the acknowledgement that her presence mattered, that she, too, had value. Charles Thompson, once the man who had expected to walk into any room and have it bend to his will, now seemed small. The other guests, once hanging on his every word, now avoided his gaze. They exchanged glances as if unsure of what to say. He was no longer the figure of admiration. It was as if Ava's simple act had peeled back the layers of his carefully constructed image, revealing the fragility beneath it. But the most shocking part was that Charles, the billionaire CEO, didn't try to challenge her again. He didn't lash out or make another sarcastic remark. Instead, he sat back in his seat, his posture deflated, as though the wind had been knocked out of him. Ava had done the unthinkable. She had turned the table. She had shown him and everyone else in the room that power was not about dominance or control, but about self-respect, dignity, and the quiet strength of knowing your worth. As Ava continued to serve the table, she noticed the change in the air. The atmosphere was different now. It wasn't filled with the tension of before, but with something else, something she couldn't quite name. Respect. For the first time she felt like she was being seen, truly seen. It wasn't the kind of attention she had ever wanted, but it was the kind she had always deserved. Ava had always been aware of the way she was treated differently because of her job, because of the color of her skin. But tonight something had shifted. She wasn't invisible anymore. And that made all the difference. As the dinner continued, Charles remained quiet. No longer the loud, confident man he once was. He seemed to shrink with every passing moment. His mind must have been racing, replaying the events over and over, wondering how he had lost control. He tried to regain his composure, but Ava could see it in his eyes. He had been humbled. She had reminded him of something he had forgotten. That real power wasn't about making people feel small. It was about lifting them up. And in doing so, Ava had not only won respect from everyone in the room, but she had also found something for herself. The recognition she had longed for. The worth she had always known she had, but had never seen reflected in the eyes of others. But now it was undeniable. She had taken back the power, and in doing so had changed the course of the night. Ava didn't need to say a word. Her actions had spoken louder than any speech ever could. And in that moment, she knew that nothing could ever diminish her worth again. As the evening continued, the tension in the room slowly began to dissipate, but something had fundamentally changed. Ava had set the tone for the night, and it was clear that Charles Thompson, despite his best efforts, would never be able to return to the same position of dominance he once held. He fidgeted in his seat, glancing around the room, trying to gauge the reactions of the other guests. But they no longer looked at him with the same reverence. Instead, they seemed to regard him with something far less flattering, doubt. Ava, on the other hand, moved through the room with the same quiet grace she always had, but now there was something different about her. It wasn't just her poise, it was the way people looked at her. For the first time in her life, Ava felt truly seen. Not as a mere waitress, not as a servant, but as a person with undeniable worth. The guests who had once spoken over her, who had barely acknowledged her presence, now looked at her with respect. Some even gave her nods of approval as she passed by, a silent acknowledgement of the power she had just displayed. Charles, meanwhile, was growing increasingly uncomfortable. The realization that his arrogance had backfired was beginning to sink in. His pride, once an impenetrable shield, now seemed to mock him. He had underestimated Ava, and in doing so, had lost the one thing that had made him invincible in the eyes of the world: control. He had been so used to commanding respect that he hadn't considered that respect could be earned in a different way. Ava had taught him that lesson not with words but with actions. And as the evening wore on, the silence that had followed her simple but powerful gesture remained. No one was speaking to Charles with the same enthusiasm. No one was waiting for his opinion or seeking his approval. Ava had shifted the balance. By the time the dinner reached its conclusion, Charles had barely spoken a word. He attempted to reassert himself, making a few half-hearted comments, but they fell flat, swallowed by the weight of the room's new atmosphere. Ava, on the other hand, remained calm and composed. She finished her shift just as she had started it, with dignity, but now there was a quiet confidence in her steps. She no longer walked through the restaurant unnoticed. The evening had been a turning point for her. She had always known her worth, but now for the first time the world seemed to recognize it as well. As she walked past Charles one last time before the night ended, she glanced at him. He was staring into his glass, his face a mixture of frustration and self-reflection. Ava didn't need to say anything. She had already made her point. As she exited the room, she couldn't help but smile to herself. She hadn't just stood up to a billionaire CEO. She had shown the world that power wasn't always about wealth, but about the quiet strength that comes with self-respect. It was a lesson that Charles, no matter how rich or powerful, would never forget. The following week things had shifted in ways Ava never could have anticipated. The restaurant, which had once been a backdrop to her routine, now felt different. It wasn't just the guests who treated her differently. It was the entire atmosphere. Charles Thompson's presence lingered in her mind, but not for the reasons one might expect. It wasn't anger or resentment that she carried from that night. It was the undeniable sense of accomplishment, of knowing that she had finally claimed her space. But as she moved through her daily tasks, she couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in the way her coworkers looked at her. The respect in their eyes was something she hadn't expected. People no longer spoke over her or disregarded her. They sought her out, asked her opinion, and treated her as if she were on the same level, rather than someone who simply served their meals. It was a quiet shift, but it was powerful. Ava found herself in a conversation with one of the regulars, an older man who had always been cordial but distant. "I have to say you really handled yourself well the other night," he remarked, his voice carrying a tone of newfound respect. "I've seen a lot of people come and go, but I haven't seen someone stand up to someone like him and do it with such grace." "That was impressive." Ava smiled softly, nodding. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm but confident. "I think sometimes people forget that respect isn't something you ask for. It's something you earn." As the days passed, Ava began to feel a sense of clarity she hadn't realized she was missing. Her life, once defined by the struggle for recognition, now seemed full of possibility. She wasn't just waiting for the world to notice her anymore. She was taking charge of her own narrative. The shift wasn't only internal. She noticed that Charles was no longer a frequent presence at the restaurant. When he did visit, he barely spoke to her, his once invincible demeanor now replaced with a kind of awkwardness. Ava could see it in his eyes. He had been humbled, but not in the way he had expected. The power dynamics had changed, and he was no longer the one holding all the cards. Ava didn't feel pity for him. She didn't feel the need to rub her success in his face. She simply moved forward, focused on her own journey. She had learned that standing up for herself didn't require bitterness. It required strength, and now Ava was stronger than ever. One evening, as Ava left her shift, the manager stopped her in the hallway. "Ava," he began, his tone more serious than usual, "I wanted to let you know that we've decided to offer you a promotion. You've been doing an outstanding job, and we've all noticed the way you handle yourself with such professionalism." Ava blinked in surprise, momentarily stunned by the offer. "A promotion?" she repeated, still processing the words. "Yes, you've earned it," he said, giving her a warm smile. "We think you're ready to take on more responsibility." Ava smiled, a wave of gratitude and pride washing over her. She had worked hard to get here, and now she could see that all of her efforts were paying off. It wasn't just about the promotion. It was about the recognition she had finally earned. Ava knew that she had reached a turning point. The respect, the opportunity, the strength, all of it had come from within. She had learned that power wasn't something you took from others. It was something you built for yourself, piece by piece, with dignity and courage. And as she stepped into the future, Ava was ready to face whatever came next with the same quiet confidence that had carried her through the toughest of battles. As weeks went by, Ava's life began to transform in ways she hadn't expected. The promotion she had been offered at the restaurant felt like just the beginning. For the first time in a long while, she felt like the world was opening up to her, and she was ready to step forward. Her confidence had grown, and the respect she had earned wasn't just from her coworkers or the guests. It came from within herself. Ava no longer waited for validation from others. She had discovered something more powerful. Her own voice. Charles Thompson, though a shadow of his former self, was still a presence in the city. He'd made a few attempts to contact her after that fateful night, but Ava never responded. She had nothing to prove to him. Instead, she focused on her own journey, building the life she had always wanted. One evening, as she worked a late shift, Ava found herself face to face with someone who had always been kind to her, a regular customer named Mrs. Parker. Mrs. Parker had always been one of the few people who treated Ava like more than just a server. They had struck up a conversation one night, and Mrs. Parker had been quick to recognize Ava's potential. "Ava, I've been meaning to tell you something," Mrs. Parker said, her voice warm but serious. "You've really impressed me with the way you've handled everything. Your strength, your poise. It's not something you see every day." Ava felt a flutter of pride, but she stayed humble. "Thank you, Mrs. Parker," she said, smiling. "That means a lot to me. I want you to know," Mrs. Parker continued, "I've spoken to a few people I know in the business world. You have so much potential and I believe you could do great things. If you ever want to talk about opportunities outside of here, I'm happy to help." Ava blinked in surprise. The idea of leaving the restaurant had never crossed her mind, but hearing someone like Mrs. Parker, a successful and respected woman, offer such a chance made her realize just how far she had come. "I really appreciate that," Ava said, her heart beating a little faster. "I've been thinking a lot about my future, and I'm open to exploring new paths." "You should," Mrs. Parker said with a knowing smile. "You deserve more than you think." That conversation stayed with Ava long after her shift ended. It was a reminder that she was capable of so much more than just surviving. She had the skills, the intelligence, and the resilience to create the future she wanted. Over the next few months, Ava started taking steps toward her new goals. She enrolled in an online business course, something she had always wanted to do, but had never found the time for. She began networking with people who shared her aspirations, and slowly but surely, she started to build a new path for herself. Ava knew that this wasn't the end of her journey. It was just the beginning. She had learned how to stand up for herself, how to command respect, and most importantly, how to believe in her own potential. The world had always told her that she was just a waitress, just a woman of color working in a service job. But now she knew better. She was more than that. She was a woman of strength, of vision, and of power. And nothing could take that away from her. Months passed, and Ava continued to thrive in ways she had never imagined. Her work at the restaurant had become less of a routine and more of a foundation for the future she was now actively building. She had started her online business course, which was already beginning to open new doors for her. Each lesson, each connection she made, added another layer to the confidence she was building. It wasn't just about the knowledge she was gaining, but about the sense of possibility she had once thought was beyond her reach. Ava's days were busy, juggling her shifts at the restaurant and her studies, but there was a new energy in her. She no longer felt like she was just surviving. She felt like she was living with intention, moving toward something bigger. One evening, after a particularly long shift, Ava received a call from Mrs. Parker. "Ava," Mrs. Parker's voice was warm on the other end, "I've been thinking about you. There's an opportunity I want to share. I know a few people who are looking for someone with your skills. It's a big step, but I think you're ready." Ava's heart raced as she listened. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. The moment someone saw her not as a waitress, but as someone who could make a real impact. "I'm listening," Ava replied, her voice steady. "It's a position with a tech company. They're looking for someone to handle their client relations and partnerships. I thought of you immediately," Mrs. Parker continued. "I know it's a leap, but I believe in you." Ava took a deep breath. The opportunity was everything she had been working toward. It was a risk, but it was a risk she was ready to take. "I'd love to meet with them," Ava said, her voice full of determination. The next few days were a whirlwind of interviews, preparation, and excitement. Ava was both nervous and exhilarated, but she held on to the confidence she had built. She knew her worth now. She knew she was capable of more than she had ever allowed herself to believe. When the day of the interview arrived, Ava walked into the office building with her head held high. She was no longer the young woman who had felt invisible. She was a woman who had earned her place, who had fought for the respect she deserved. The interview went smoothly, her words flowing with ease, her confidence shining through. By the end of the week, she received the call she had been waiting for. "Ava, we'd like to offer you the position," the voice on the other end said. "Welcome aboard." Ava couldn't help but smile. She had done it. She had taken the leap, and now her life was about to change. That night, as she sat alone in her apartment, Ava reflected on everything she had overcome. She had gone from a waitress dismissed by the world, to someone with opportunities she had once only dreamed of. But it wasn't just the job that mattered, it was the journey. The confidence, the strength, the self-belief she had gained along the way. Ava knew that this was just the beginning. She had proved to herself that she could create her own path. And now the world was ready to see what she would do next. The first day at her new job felt surreal. Ava walked into the sleek office building, the glass walls reflecting the city's skyline as she stepped through the doors. The hum of conversation, the clicking of keyboards, the bustle of people moving through their day. All of it was new. Yet, in some way it felt like she belonged here. Her first few weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, learning the ropes and adapting to her new role. Ava handled it all with the same quiet confidence that had brought her this far. The work was demanding, but it felt different now. She wasn't just showing up to work. She was showing up for herself, for the future she was building. Ava found herself in meetings with executives, discussing strategies, partnerships, and goals for the company. It was a far cry from the restaurant, where she had once been invisible to those in power. Now she was in the room, her voice heard, her ideas valued. The transition wasn't without its challenges. There were moments when she felt the weight of imposter syndrome creeping in, the quiet doubts telling her she didn't belong. But each time she pushed those thoughts aside, reminded herself of how far she had come, and stepped forward with the same strength that had carried her through every difficult moment of her life. As the months went by, Ava began to excel in her role. Her boss, Sarah, had noticed her ability to handle even the most difficult clients with grace and professionalism. "Ava," Sarah said one afternoon after a meeting, "I just wanted to take a moment to tell you how impressed I am. You've really made an impact here, and I'm excited to see where you go next." Ava smiled, grateful for the acknowledgement. It was moments like these that reminded her of how much she had grown. She wasn't just doing well in her job, she was thriving. And as her confidence continued to grow, Ava began to set her sights on even bigger goals. She started mentoring new hires, offering advice and support, just as she had once wished for. She remembered the moments when she felt lost and uncertain, and now she wanted to be the person who could guide others through those times. The company recognized her dedication, and within a year, Ava was offered a leadership position. It was everything she had worked for. But this time it wasn't just about the title, it was about the journey. Ava had learned that success wasn't something handed to her. It was something she had earned through her actions, her determination, and her belief in herself. As she accepted the new position, Ava couldn't help but think back to the days when she had been dismissed, underestimated, and ignored. She had come so far from those moments, and now she was standing at the top, not because of luck, but because of her own strength and perseverance. Ava knew that the road ahead would still have its challenges, but she was ready for whatever came next. She had already proven to herself that she was capable of so much more than she had ever imagined. And now the world was watching as she stepped into the next chapter of her life, confident and unshakable.